My name is Mattia Kostakis, and I'm an MBA student at MIT Sloan, and had the fortune to be the panel lead for the Beyond Crunching Numbers, How to Have an Influence panel. With us today, we have a very distinguished panel of guests. We have Ken Catanella, Director of Basketball Operations of the Detroit Pistons, Sig Mejdal, Director of Decision Science of the Houston Astros, Sam Hinkie, Executive Vice President of Basketball Operations, Prasad Sethi, Vice President of People Analytics from Google, and Alex Shiner, President of the Cleveland Browns. And we have our moderator here, Cade Massey, Professor of the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. The panel is going to run until about 9:45, and then we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you have questions, you can tweet them to hashtag SSAC13, hashtag 210. 210 is the room number we're in. You can do that anytime during the panel. So with that, I'll turn it over to Cade.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, guys. The motivation for this panel is the idea that knowing the right answer is about half the game, may not even be half the game, that the other half is persuading people that it's the right thing to do. We were just talking about some hallway conversations about Sam was talking about someone asking him, Sam, who are the three smartest people at the conference this year? And they had fun with that conversation, but then Sam turns and says, I can tell you what, they're not the three most effective people. And what I think we're trying to do today is to talk about how do we move from being smart, or relatively smart anyway, to being more effective. So the thing is, that's harder than many people appreciate. So one of the things I thought we might start with is, you guys have been doing this for a while, you're some of the best in the business at this, and yet even you make mistakes. So it's a hard thing to do. What are some of the mistakes you guys have made in your careers that show how hard this is to do well?
That's easy for me. I think it was one of my first behaviors when I got hired on about 8 years ago at the Cardinals, and it was a giant bias I took into this industry, and it came from, because of where I came from. I was from the research world, the academic world. My last job was at NASA Ames, where the scientific method is the air you breathe. Nobody's questioning it. It's what drives the day. It's what drives the decisions. And I naively assumed, well, that goes on in all industries. And I remember giving a presentation related to the draft to the scouts and the scouting director. And as it's going on, they're quiet. And I'm thinking, all right, they're understanding this. I have a scattergram here and there. Things are going well. At the end of the presentation, it's still quiet. And I remember thinking, this is going to be easier than I thought. We're going to be drafting really well in a month from now. But in hindsight, or quickly after that, I realized that it wasn't because they were, in agreement with this process or this scientific method, the idea of testing your hypothesis and finding out if what you think really is, that their method was different. And in order for them to be in that room, they've had quite a bit of success with this alternative method, which is garnered from your experience, your observations, your memory, and your mental math to come up with your hypothesis and your behavior. So that was, a really awakening experience, and it was a little bit of work and rethinking that I needed to do for us to I think get to the point where we were drafting a little bit better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I started in the Wall Street world and trying to sell an idea as an analyst in terms of purchasing an equity, purchasing a stock that might lead to beneficial returns in a portfolio. Now I'm in the sports world where we're doing much of the same type of analysis and having the same types of conversations. And I learned early on that a lot of my job dealt with connections, connecting with people, that there was an infinitely human element to what we do. And as much as I would love to stay in a back corner and focus on a spreadsheet or a model, that I would not get anything done and I wouldn't last very long doing that. So 2 of my failures came in both worlds early on in my career, thank goodness. And likely most people tend to learn the most from their mistakes. I had one pitch where I spent 3 to 5 minutes, much like you, Sig, with an individual, and they stayed infinitely quiet, which I've now learned can be either a very good thing or a very bad thing. And at one point, I thought, yes, we're gonna actually do this deal, and this is gonna happen. The next thing I know, the individual walked out of the room to excuse himself, and I said, I guess I didn't do as good of a job as I thought I had. And the reason was I hadn't really connected with that individual yet. The key, I thought, was to build slowly with small individual successes to develop trust and an acceptance and a track record. And then eventually the bigger ideas can come through the flow of conversation. Asking questions was critical. Not coming into a room and feeling that I had all the answers, that I was 100% correct, and admitting when I was wrong. I think were some of the most important things I learned early on. And thereafter, it became a lot easier to have those conversations and generate ideas from those discussions. Because a lot of times you might have an idea or a question, but a conversation with an individual that has a vast amount of experience, like you're talking about a head coach, a GM, they'll bring out the best in you if you just take the time to get to know them and ask them questions.
I didn't do that, but to prove I'm tone deaf enough, I once made a PowerPoint deck. It was 10 pages long. The title of it was Why We're Saving More Money Than Anyone You Know, and I gave it to my young wife when we were married. And maybe in our second year of marriage, that didn't go very well.
Prasad, it must be easy at Google to convince people to do things right.
Sometimes. I've been at Google for 5.5 years now, and so have had many opportunities to fail. First of all, you might be wondering, what is Google doing in a sports analytics panel? Well, I'm here to represent a sport that's not televised very frequently, the contact sport of software programming. No, it's not violent at all. It's a very civilized workplace. But I lead a group called People Analytics, and the intent behind our formation was we make thousands of people decisions as an organization. Every large organization does. We're now at 40,000 people. And we wanted to make sure that we had the same level of rigor in making people decisions as we do with any of our business decisions. And so when I started, I said, all these software engineers out there, they're working on these very complex algorithms that return all the results that you folks get when you type something into the search engine. So I said, these folks must be used to algorithmic models to making people decisions as well. So I said, all people decisions should be made by data and analytics. One of the processes that we take very, very seriously at Google is how we promote our software engineers. How do you get from one level to the next level, right? And it's a very intense process, and what we do right now is we fly in hundreds of our senior-most engineers from around the world, and twice a year we form these committees so that it's not just the engineers, managers who are making these promotion decisions, but these independent committees so that we remove bias. But it's very intensive. We fly hundreds of engineers in, and they form these committees, and they're reviewing these promotion packets twice a year. And we said, can we make this simpler for them? Can we reduce the load? So my team built this really complex algorithm based on empirical data. And we said, for 30% of these promotion cases, with 95% accuracy, we can come up with the same decision that the committees would have made. So we went to the engineers very excited. We told them, we can reduce your load by 30%, and over time our models will keep getting better and better, right? And we'll reduce your load, and now you can make promotion decisions without human intervention. We thought they'd be excited. They hated it. They said, we don't want to hide behind a black box for something so serious as people decisions, right? So that changed the nature of what I thought my team was all about. We don't think anymore that it's really about replacing humans to make decisions. Instead, it is to make sure that the human decision makers that we have are free of bias. And so all the analytics that we do at Google is now shaped towards how do we reduce bias from the decision maker side? Because as you folks know, in the social sciences, if you get models that explain 30, 40% of variance, you're golden. I mean, you are doing really, really well, which is very different from the software side of the house where you have 90, 95% of variance explained. So I think there's still room for humans in the decision making, and that's one of the big lessons learned for me.
I guess the biggest mistake we made was bringing on Cade Massey about 6 years ago for the Dallas Cowboys. Seriously, about 6 years ago, you didn't know I was going there with this, did you? About 6 years ago, I read an article, Peter King wrote an article about inefficiencies of the NFL draft, right? And it was a paper written by Cade and a guy named Dick Thaler. So I just literally picked up the phone and called Cade, and I said, can you guys help us out? And what's funny is over time, over the last 6, 7 years, what I get from Cade and Dick all the time is like, why aren't you guys doing this? I'm getting emails from Dick during games, like, why'd you go for it here? And kind of culminated last year, we had a dinner in San Diego. It was Dick Thaler, it was some owners from the Cowboys, and we're talking about kind of how much progress we're making in analytics. And it's one of our owners, and Dick says, like, why do you need to make progress? Why don't you just do it? You know, and I thought that's like kind of the crux of this panel, right? It's not so easy. You can't just do it. There are tons of people to influence. It's not just one person. You've got your coaches, you've got your scouts, you've got your owner, your GM, your personnel guys, your trainers. And you have to spend a lot more time thinking about how to get the message across than what the message is. And Sam Hinkie probably told me the smartest thing that I've heard this year. We were talking just about, he did. We were talking about like where should you go, where should you work when you're thinking about these things, what are the decisions you make? And he said, the most important thing, I think, is to be surrounded by like-minded people. Right? Because otherwise, you're always fighting this uphill battle with whatever you've learned. And I don't know, I'll kick it back to you, Sam. Do you have any more insights on that?
We have a job opening, there's one. Email samh@rocketball.com. We have 1,600 resumes, and we have a job opening.
Me? Send
Not
my
you.
resume?
No, you said like-minded people. We need more. So email us at the Rockets. We're looking for people for sure. Because we're picky. We're picky. Although I learned before the panel, Prasad was telling us like all the ways we're barbaric, which makes a lot of sense.
No, it's interesting. I'm sorry.
But Sam, the point Sam made is he's being humble because we're on the panel. But his point was you're always going to be overruled, always. And so I think sometimes in these panels we think, okay, here are the answers, we'll just do it. There's always going to be someone in an organization who, it's the owner, and even if it's the owner, the fans are going to weigh in. And how do you do best with these things? Let's hear it. Come on, give us some juice here.
On that?
Yeah.
I do believe it's pretty critical to be like, be in a place where people, you need diversity of opinion in a big way, but where people think about the process in a similar way, which is like you're sort of seeking all the time, like constantly looking for better inputs, and but you're open to uncertainty, right? So you're like convicted to what you're doing, but you're open to uncertainty, so you'll listen, and when you'll make a decision, you'll like look at it one way and invert it, and invert it again, and invert it again to try to figure out all the different ways that people can see that. And if you're the type of person that hates that process, right? This is like, no, I can see it from the front. It's that, we're done, right? Then that makes it for a challenging environment.
Yeah, I was surprised that you found benefit in having the similar background within your organization. I found the most benefit from having divergent backgrounds, especially in the front office, because each person lends a completely valuable and different perspective that at the end of the day, it probably comes down to somewhat of a wisdom of crowds philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of the times we've seen in more literature that the best decisions are often made from completely different opinions. In our organization, it's exactly that way, and I think it's structured beautifully to have someone that's focused purely on perhaps the background element of a player, or someone that's focused purely on the coaching element. So we have former coaches that are scouts. We have former players that are scouts that get into the interpersonal side of people, the analytical piece, and then perhaps somebody that's more experienced. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, the chief decision maker has much more information to make that final decision.
So that's great in theory. Mm-hmm. Sounds perfect. Mm-hmm. But it must be hard to actually pull that off, to get the analytics in with the intuitive judgment. I mean, that's the ideal thing, but that's so hard to get everyone on the same page. And I think about the work that Sig and Jeff did with the Cardinals and now with the Astros at trying to blend Moneyball type analytics with traditional scouts. I'm curious how you guys pull that off.
No, I think what Alex says is true. It's wonderful when you have like-minded persons who are curious and wanting to re-examine the convention. And I think with the situation with the Astros, that there was so much turnover that we were, although we had a diverse background, we at least were able to bring in persons that are critical thinkers, or well practiced in that. But in the Cardinals, we were outsiders coming in, and there was no turnover. And so it was a different world. Like old dogs had to learn new tricks to some degree, and they did it at different rates. And so what Alex speaks about, the importance of doing it gradually, cannot be cannot be overemphasized. That I remember with Jeff, like, look, we could increase our efficiency by X if we do this immediately, let's do it. And he had more experience. He was like, no, we're implementing change in a time, as was 8 years ago, things were a little bit different than they are now, that we need to be more sensitive and more strategic. And so we did it very gradual. We did it with dabbling with a couple, seniors who don't have much leverage in the draft, so you could get them cheap, or some later round juniors where there just wasn't a whole lot of, loss of stomach lining for these picks. And these guys became anecdotes. They did surprisingly well to much of the established thinking, and they became anecdotes. Even though we had the scattergram, the power of experiencing in an anecdote goes a long way. And so at the very least, some of the experienced persons were thinking, man, maybe these two clowns have a little something to add. Mm-hmm. And then from there, it was more and more, and as the anecdotes made the major leagues, we eventually we went in with both feet. And when I say both feet, I don't mean we were, simply drafting these wonderful performers, but we were drafting Cardinal guys, or now Astros guys that, given all the information we had, were telling us these guys were the best bets to be of major league value. Mm-hmm. And we could have done that immediately, but it probably would have been a failure. And because of Jeff's foresight with that, it was gradual and I think successful.
I want to hear more on this gradual strategy. Some of you guys have talked about this over the years. I mean, and maybe you made this mistake early on, but you guys are more experienced now, and so you probably take a longer view. What are some of the gradual steps you've taken to build these kinds of change, but you recognize you don't do it in a month? Some things you don't do in a year. What are some of the gradual steps that you're taking to change your organization, or that you have taken in the past to change your organizations?
I think one thing you do is you track the decisions that are made, and so that there's not so much conflict to that, right? So while you're making decisions, you say, let's see why we made this decision and see what came out of it. And then you do that over time, and then you can look back and say, here's what happened. And once again, it's instead of saying, here's what we should do, you're just saying, here's why we made this decision and what happened. And then I think Sig makes a great point, which is that it's a little counterintuitive, but you need to use anecdotes to drive analytics. It's really funny. And Cade used to hate it. We used to do this with the Cowboys a little bit, and I'd say, Cade, we have to kind of tell real life stories. And he'd say, well, now it's no better than just picking a guy. And so that's true, but no one relates to scattergrams or whatever they are. No one does. And you need to just talk about players and how we made the decision, and that will stick. And hopefully it represents good decision making. We talked about a little bit yesterday. You don't want to be outcome biased. On the other hand, you need to use some outcomes to support the processes you use.
A couple of approaches that we have tried to establish credibility. One is just around testing and learning, right? So if people don't know what the right answer is, why don't we test it out, test a new approach out, but make sure that you have a very controlled experiment. You take all kinds of effort to make sure that it's statistically valid once you get the results back. And that's helped us a lot. So again, I don't know what the parallels would be to the sports world, but a lot of things that we do are trying to develop great leaders for our organization, people who can help us scale. And we don't know what makes for a great leader or how you get someone ready to be a great leader. And the conventional wisdom in the HR space is that you have certain types of training or certain types of experiences that actually if you put someone through, that it results in a great leader. And we said, well, we don't know whether any of those things work at Google. Let's try out a bunch of these things and then figure out what our own model is going to be. So that kind of approach has helped us. The second one is more about the decision-making process itself in terms of what we were talking about earlier. When you have groups set together, whether they're diverse or similar-minded, I think one of the things that is often easy to do is to fall into groupthink, right? And so one person can sway the rest of the people just around them, and then the whole group is thinking the same way. So we started doing, for many of our important decisions, we started doing cognitive bias training of the groups. And all of you know what some of these cognitive biases are. When you're talking about people decisions, especially, the biases are things like the halo effect. You know, I saw this person do a great job once 3 years back, and I still think they are great. Or the Horn effect, which is just the opposite. There's recency bias, and so on. All of these standard things. So when we went into a lot of our people decision meetings, we would say, every one of you has a role. Look at all of these biases, and you're going to be the police of making sure that we're going to avoid this particular bias in the conversation. When you hear someone talking about this person, and it's just something that they observed recently, you just say recency bias, right? So you give people different roles in the organization so that they are free from that group thing. So that's another approach that we have tried with some of our decision making.
You guys think it's important that these lessons and these data come from inside the organization? Sometimes I think that a firm isn't convinced until they've convinced themselves to some extent. I know you guys are like that hugely at Google. You're somewhat talking about that too, Alec. You want to keep data year over year, and eventually after 5 years of Dallas Cowboy data, maybe you'll have something. How much does it need to come? You can learn maybe an idea from the outside, but how much does the evidence need to come from inside before you're actually convinced? Even Sig, you're talking about the anecdotes that bubble up from the minor leagues. Then you're able to do something. Is that something people should pay attention to?
I think it has to come from inside, in my experience, that the tenure of the decision makers in baseball or in other sports is not very long. And for them to have the confidence to rely on something that may not be intuitive, it has to come from inside, because there needs to be the dialogue and the questioning of it. Because after all, it's a model. It's an imperfect representation of the real world. And you're giving him something imperfect, and you want to know, well, have you thought of this? Yeah. How about this? Yeah. Until he's exhausted his efforts of poking holes at the model till he has something that he has confidence in. But if it appears on Fangraphs or Baseball Prospectus, who are doing great work, you can't have that back and forth, and you can't. It's a lot more difficult to give the decision maker the confidence to risk his short career on analytics.
This is related to something I've heard Ken say before. It kind of surprises me. You think, persuasion means confidence, right? You're supposed to be sure of what you have to say. Ken, I've heard you say that never be sure you're 100% right when you're going into a room. Most people would be surprised, but I thought you were more persuasive when you were 100% sure.
I think it gets back to the human element, because if you think about somebody coming into your office and grandstanding and putting on a show and saying, I am 100% right, there's no way that you could possibly be right. There's no way that you could possibly have something to add to this discussion, or that it couldn't get better. Doesn't that make it eminently hard for you to accept the idea and then not only internalize it, but make it an actionable item? I mean, that's what we're really trying to do, and that's what analysts are trying to do. They're trying to make an impact on an organization by transferring their knowledge to somebody that will actually make use of it. Whether it's trying to get information to a player who's about to guard somebody that has to be able to internalize it to the point where he doesn't even have to think about it. He knows exactly the way he wants to guard that individual so that it's reflex. To the GM that gets faith in the information and the decision that he's ultimately making from that discussion. And he actually potentially partakes in the ultimate conclusion by adding to the discussion and tinkering with the idea, like you said. Okay, so I think a lot of times our ideas are not entirely fully formed even. And sometimes I come into someone's office looking for guidance. So I think that just allows other people to gain greater acceptance and embrace your ideas when you have that type of approach.
I think those that speak with confidence, it's a hurdle. It's difficult at times. That I think the more expertise you have in the field, the less likely you are to speak in absolute terms. But we as human beings are attracted to the person with complete confidence that's pounding the table saying, this guy is going to do this. And that doesn't often come with expertise. That comes, I think, with the naivety of the variability that's still to come. And although we feel completely certain at this time, there's a lot of times and a lot of things that could still take place to create this divergence that is hard to appreciate without sort of the feedback loop of analyzing your past decisions. And the more you do that, the more I think you're humbled and less confident in saying something with certainty.
The screwy part is the market rewards the confidence whether it's right or not, especially in hindsight. So like Michael Lewis wrote that piece on Obama in Vanity Fair, and he was saying like all the decisions I face are like 30 to 40% odds, but the American people don't want to hear like, we thought this was a 32% chance of working and it didn't work. Like it was the best option I had on the table. Like no, they want to hear like, I know this was exactly right. We did this, trust me. And they do, and even in our sports, they do when they're right. So when they're right, everybody jumps on board. It's like, yes, we picked him, we drafted him, we traded for him. We have the Midas touch, right? Everyone, the market seems to reward that sort of bravado, and they don't like the fact that like this is our best option, and we think this is a 50-50 chance. We'll talk in generalities that would like embarrass this conference. Like we'll talk like this guy's a 1 in 2 chance with huge risk, right? This guy is a 1 in 3 chance with enormous upside. This guy is like a 1 in 10 chance, and we want to stay away from it, right? People think like we're down to like 7 decimal points, and like draft night, we're trying to decide between players, and this is the conversation we're having with our owner.
Right. So, and are you willing to say I don't know, Sam? Do you ever say I don't know?
I do a lot. I do enough that it makes people uncomfortable sometimes, I think.
Like, why are you employed here?
Yeah, no one knows. So I think it builds trust with people if you're honest with them and say you don't know when you don't. And the other thing that's different is if you say it as much as I say it, when you don't say it, the difference is palpable, right? So there's our coaches will come with questions, and I often say like I don't know. Usually I say I don't know. I'll think about it, or I don't know. I'll get back to you tomorrow, or I don't know. That's interesting, and let me noodle on it a little bit. Other times they come and they ask, and I'm ready, right? And I give them 5 minutes on why there's one clear answer here. And they can tell the difference over time because they know I won't BS them about stuff that I don't know. And the other thing I'll do is just lean on their experience all the time. Like, we'll say, I don't know, I'll go look at it. You go look at it. We'll say, no one slept last night. We beat this up. The data says kind of this, kind of that. None of it you should trust. We should go with whoever has the most experience. That's you. You've been doing this 25 years. Whatever your gut tells you is way better than what my gut tells me. So whatever you want to do, I'll support you. And if you want me to help you think through it, I'll help. But if you don't, I got your back. Whatever you want to do.
How do you find coaches and players on that front? So since Michael Lewis wrote that piece about Battier, we all talk about Battier, and he's so open to these numbers. Is he someone that wanted to kick around uncertainties and look at probabilities? Is that what he was looking for? How did you approach that situation?
No, he's similar to our coaches. He's busy and wants an answer and wants whatever you think your best guidance is, and he would disagree with it sometimes. Most of our coaches are the same way. They have like another game, like they fly all night and they have another game in 18 hours and they're supposed to sleep somewhere in that period, right? And so they have limited time to prepare, and so all they want to know is like what will help, right, in as succinct a way as possible. And they're fine with the uncertainty because they deal with it all the time. But what do you think, right? And so we often say we think this or that very clearly, very broadly, or we don't know. It's unclear, right? It's unclear. Do whatever you've always done. It's as good as anything we've got right now. But other times, it's definitely this, right? It's definitely to play him this way or to play a team this way or something. And so that difference, I think, makes a big difference. But yeah, Betty would be like, yeah, he didn't want to hear any uncertainty. He'd be like, left or right? Which way do you want him to go? Left or right? And so we would say left or right or blank.
Okay. So you need an organization that's willing to be okay with that I don't know middle category, but you as an analyst need to know, you need to be able to sometimes take stands and give people this prescription and then know when not to give the prescription. This sounds hard, though. This does sound hard.
Yeah, because I think you'll lose your credibility in a hurry if you give some, if you sound like all confident on some like 52-48 chance, like it won't take many of those that don't go well for people to say he doesn't know what he's talking about.
I think this is one of the hardest things in analytics because the thing we're most sure of is how uncertain things are. But no one's impressed with certainty about uncertainty. No one but academics are impressed with certainty about uncertainty. How do you sell the importance of uncertainty? I mean, you got the NFL cracked by now, Alec? You kind of know, you got it all figured out?
No, but you can't, I mean, I think you can spend a lot of time telling people that this is like a 50-50 chance. And that can impact decision making, right? So when you know there shouldn't be certainty about something, you might act a different way, right? I mean, you might acquire more assets instead of choosing one asset. And so it can be helpful. Going back to something Sam said, I think the most important thing, what we're really talking about here is trust. And that's why Sam says, I don't know, when he doesn't know. Because if you don't have trust between all of the decision makers, this isn't going to work. And they'll look at you, you'll come in, you'll present some PowerPoint, they'll smile, and then they'll go do what they want to do. Unless they think that you're actually trying to help them, right? And then they start trusting you either as a person, I mean, there are various ways to gain that trust, then they're going to ignore it because they've been successful doing it the way they've done it. They didn't need you in the past. And so I think that's like the most important thing to take away from this is how do you build that trust up so at the right moment when you're saying, I'm pretty sure about this, they're saying, I think this person wants to win, I think they're in this with me, and we can use all of this information together.
So I've heard you guys talk about relationships over the years, and I've heard you talk about specific relationships, and how have you gone about building that kind of trust? What kinds of steps have you taken with, whether it's the GM or a coach or a player, building the kind of credibility and trust that allows you to be more persuasive with them?
Well, a lot of the things I mentioned earlier in terms of being open to ideas, and also one way to not necessarily build the trust, but also to get their trust more on a job level as far as not an interpersonal level, is to think about what they really need.
So let me push you though, because I knew you as you created a relationship with Coach K. How is it that you were able to work for Coach K?
Well, that was a very challenging one because you think about I had played some professional basketball in Europe and worked in the front office over there, but here's a program and a coach that had credentials, infinite credentials and a prestigious program. How could I add value walking in as a graduate assistant at that time? And I noticed a few things in terms of their pregame prep, and I was doing some video logging of opponent games, and I automated a process that created what now is commonplace, but over a decade ago was a rarity, is a shot zone chart that had visuals and colors. And at that point, I gave it to the coaching staff and thought nothing of it. And the next thing I knew, at the practice later that day in preparation for the next day's game, coach had blown it up to an infinite size, brought it over to the bench where the guys were sitting. Of course, it was a proud moment for a geek like me, but he showed it to the guys and said, this is what we have to do to stop this team if we play this player this way. And at that moment, I realized if you can just find that niche of something that is missing or that you could add an element that can make them better at their job, they're going to really appreciate you and trust that you have their best interests at heart, like you're saying, Alec. And if you show that you have a passion for the game too and winning, and that you're a person that has a similar mindset and similar goals, those things also have powerful impact.
I think you have to understand their job too, right? I mean, you can't just sit in an office and think of things and just tell people what to do. I mean, if you think of what a scout does in the NFL, their job is to isolate good players, right? College or pro, that's their job. So to go in and say, you don't even need to look at it this way, goes against everything they've done their whole lives. You have to take the time to figure out what is it about this guy's job, what's he do on a daily basis, and then you can have a real conversation. Otherwise, you're just talking on different planes.
I think for all the wonderful things that Moneyball did, one of the things that made it more difficult in the baseball world was its framing of the question as an either-or question. You're either going with your veteran, grizzled scouts, or you're going with the socially awkward nerd in the corner of the room, and there's no middle ground. But I think really making it clear like what we're trying to do, and it's simply we're trying to use all the information available in the most appropriate way. And if we genuinely are believers of that, a large chunk of this information is going to come from the scouts, and these men are truly experts in this field, and that demands your respect, and you need to treat them respectfully. I think the scene in Moneyball where it's blah, blah, blah is the antithesis of actually how you have to interact with them. And that the hypothesis that they've developed over the decades of their work is incredibly important if you're genuinely interested in using all the info available. And so I think when they saw that it's not this either or, it was this and we're really interested in their expertise, so much so that we're taking notes and we're changing the scouting form and we're analyzing their hypothesis, it becomes different. It becomes a challenge to them, and we're in it together, and we're going to improve this as much as we can, and it's not the, you just keep talking, we'll handle it over there.
Do you have to worry about relationships at the Rocket, Sam? I mean, it's Daryl's kingdom, right? You really have to worry about relationships there?
For sure. The thing Sig said, they're often right. That's the thing that people don't talk about. Like, often conventional, we pick apart the conventional wisdom that's wrong, and there's a lot of it out there, and there's a lot of it none of us understand. Like, most of it's right? And some of it's so right, you should turn your brain off and just make it your new rule, right? Because it's good, because it's like evolution. People like thousands and thousands of experiments over the last 50 years in basketball got to like reasonable answers. Get back on defense. Like, that's a pretty good one. That's a pretty good one. Get back. Like, it'll help. You know, like Hank Iva, was working on that a long time ago and settled it, and it works. And like supporting people when it works is really useful, and showing them that your tools can help decipher which ones work and which ones don't, and support the ones they like. So we do some of that to build trust. Like, you'll have some decision that is conventional wisdom, and you'll study it, and I'll say, like, all right, 90-10, this is the way coaches do it, right? And I'll say, I've looked at your career. They get really nervous then, right? I've looked at your career. You've been in this situation 1,000 times. 985, you did it. 98.5%, right? 985, you did it exactly like this. Perfect. Never lose sleep over that again. Never worry about that again. It's like brushing your teeth. Like, all the time. Just do that every single time. All of our math says that's right. Right? It's comforting in some sense that they're like, oh, great. On all the checklist of things, or all the questions that everyone second guesses themselves about after the game, that's not on my list. That's not on my list, because not only everyone I've ever coached with and every game I've ever played did I think that was right, but all of our best people as well are out telling me they think that's right. So I'm going to worry about something else. I'm going to worry about how to motivate this player. I'm going to worry about how to practice tomorrow, and I'm not going to ever lose any more sleep over that one.
How much do you share when you're coming at them with something that's not conventional wisdom? So I've heard some of you guys talk about the role of transparency. So you want to be transparent in your process in some way, but how much do you actually share when it's complicated? I mean, if you tell me to be transparent, does that mean I get to talk about my model? Because I'm excited. I want to talk about my model. Is that what you mean by transparency?
I share only as much as they're interested in. Never more. As much as we can. I bet I fail at that a bunch, but never more. Like, if they don't have questions about the way things were put together, like, then who cares? I don't.
Yeah, I'm in the same way. As much as they want, to the gritty details. And I think it's important because their efforts are being adjusted to some degree. And to have that be a mystery to them, I think, would be terribly uninspiring. They've just driven 8 hours 3 times in the month to see this player. He's at the top of their list. They want him. Everything seems right. And then we strangely take this guy half a dozen spots below and don't tell him why. Like, that's not a healthy organization.
Is that connected to why you have communications? You have people analytics, you have compensation, and you have communications. Why is communications in the mix?
And that's absolutely part of it. Google is a very transparent organization. We want to make sure that people within the organization have all the data, all the information that they need, all the context that they need. So we want every one of our line managers to have as much people data about their people as we do, right? And we think that allows them to make better decisions because we're not a very top-down organization. We trust different people to use their own judgment. And making sure, not only do they want to see our models, they actually want to see the data itself. You know, we have a very curious lot, so they'll say, well, we can build better models too, right? So we don't let them play around too much with that, especially when it comes to things like compensation, because they all think they have the best way of designing compensation programs across Google. But having communications for us has been one of the most important things. I think generally, people want all of these people decisions that surround them to be made very fairly. They want to make sure that they are being treated appropriately. And for us to go around and say, this is why we have compensation designed this way, or benefits designed this way, or your learning programs designed this way, or this is why we do hiring the way we do it, because of this data and this models. I think it really helps. So selling Alec, in the past, we used to have people go through 12, 15 interviews as a candidate when they were being hired at Google. And well, we now get 2.5 million applications every year. If we started doing that, it would just, we wouldn't get any work done at all because we would just be interviewing people. And so my team did some analysis, and we found that after 4 interviews, there was no useful information that we were getting on average to make a different decision. So there was no additional information other than people were just having a good time meeting candidates. And candidates were having a good time meeting lots of Googlers. So we made the data very public. We said, this is what the models say, and this is why we want to cut it down. And so you can't talk to more than 4 people anymore, right? And if you do, then you need to get special permission from us. And that's the kind of thing that I think having more transparency makes people feel like this is not a top-down organization.
So I asked you guys to talk about some things that you might have got wrong over the years. Before we wrap up, we have 15, 20 more minutes. We're going to have some questions from the audience, but I want to give you guys a chance also to talk about some of the lessons that you've learned and some of the things that you would advocate or suggest to people who are trying to be influential in their organizations, whether it's sports or business or whatever. What are some of the lessons that you've learned from your experience?
I think one that I learned immediately and was very important, and it's often contrary to, I think, the message we get, is don't trust your gut. Or at the very least, be very skeptical of your gut. That this feeling you get from your gut, it's not some supercomputer weighing every attribute, every condition, every probability in just the right way. It's your decision-making process is doing the best it can. And if I could share a quick story, when I first got the job, I was in California. I was going to go to my dream job soon afterwards in St. Louis, and quickly put together a database of college players and made this very pathetic projection system. And this one Stanford player was number 1, Jed Lowry. So I lived near Palo Alto, so I went to the game. Couldn't wait to see this like Paul Bunyan of a player come out onto the field. And I hadn't been to a college baseball game sober in my life, and so I didn't know that college players didn't have their names on their jerseys, and so they come out, and oh gosh, I got to go buy a program. But I noticed like this number 3, this little guy on Stanford, and I thought, they must have run out of scholarships, so the physics student who played high school ball is on the team. So sure enough, you could see where this is going. I got the paper. And number 3 was Jed Lowry. And I remember getting this sick feeling, and my gut was telling me, oh shit, no, God, no. I imagined going to St. Louis and presenting this list and them sending me right back. I had quit my job. I imagined I was going to be homeless. Like, this was just this sick feeling of what value I had. And I remember, no, like as time went on, the database knew his height and knew its weight. It could, if it wanted, deduct Jed Lowry as much as it wanted, but it didn't. And our gut and some of the cognitive biases we had were saying this can't be right. This guy that doesn't look like he belongs on Stanford cannot be the best player in the country. But often that's how you're going to feel when you're making a decision, that there's been a lot of smart people in baseball doing a lot of things to improve. And if we have something to add, it's quite often, not going to be intuitive. And so that sick feeling, while it's unpleasant, there's something exciting about it too, is having the intellectual confidence to go with it. And so that idea of don't trust your gut, I think is something that I hadn't imagined before I got here.
I would say embed yourself, right? I've hit on this previously. We hired an analytics guys in the audience here, and I always tease him because he wears like Browns t-shirts every day to work. And I'm like, you didn't do that in your old job at Mozilla, did you? You were just like wearing t-shirts to work every day and pullovers. And but there's a point to it, right? He's dressing and acting like our coaches and our scouts, and they feel more comfortable with him. And if he came in every day in a suit and tie, he'd be like a foreigner in their land. And I think I'm going to hit on this again and again. If people don't trust you, they're not going to listen to you. They might act like they're listening to you, but they're not. And ultimately, you have valuable information. First, you have to build that trust. And one way to do it is to really learn about what they do. And to do that, you have to just embed yourself. Work near them, go out with them, right? See what their day-to-day is, see what their challenges are. That's really what we spend most of our time worrying about.
Yeah, because you're trying to have influence not only up the chain, you have an influence downstream as well. You want to get to know those people. You want to get a feel for, they all have desires and fears and aspirations and worries. Try to embrace those and get to the heart of what drives them and what they're looking to get out of their opportunity at your organization. When you have that connection, it's a lot easier, just like a coach who develops a connection with a player. It's a lot easier to make constructive criticism or suggestions to someone when you have that level of trust and you have that relationship. With someone you don't have it with, it can often have the complete alternative impact that you're looking for. So that would be my suggestion as well.
I'm really big on tailoring the medium, like just meeting people wherever they are and getting rid of all the friction you can get rid of that would make it challenging. So like the vendors that are outside these doors, if they come with we've got this system and it'll help your coaches and here's the URL and here's the password and here's how to use it, right? I think the URL, all right, we just lost a third of the people right there. They have to keep track of the URL wherever they are, right? And the password, we just lost more people, right? And then they have to learn how to use the system. We have lots of experience with paper, right? And so we don't even ask our people to print things. We're someone will bring it to you at just the right moment. Just when you're ready to prepare for the next game, someone will appear and they think it just happens, but it doesn't just happen because we've thought about it. They'll sit on the plane and one game's over and they're relaxed and the flight attendant hands them a drink and the video coordinator hands them a document. And he hands some of them a 10-page document and some of them a one-page document, right? Because that's best. Some of them get a text. Some of them Daryl likes email. Our owner likes brief emails. Why are we trying to make people fit our style? Why don't you try to fit theirs if that's the way they want to take in info? The whole point is to try to help them where they are. Why take any risk that they might not adjust to whatever feels natural to you?
Prasad, convincing software engineers is probably as difficult as convincing head football coaches. What have you learned in your time at Google?
Mine would be about explainability. I think going back to some of the points that made earlier by everyone on the panel, I think if something comes across as being too magical, then it's much harder to convince people, right? And the best way to build trust is to make sure that it builds on someone's experience and intuition and past decisions, rather than completely replacing it. And so we've, for many of our own models, we've had both hypothesis test-driven models where we say, okay, this is what we think is happening, and let's build regression models or other things that take those variables into account. And then in other cases, we've just tried to, go more of the machine learning neural network kind of approach, where we just let the data and the modeling, just run amok and see what comes out. And we find a lot more success with the former rather than the latter, even though the latter has much better forecasting validity, right? Because of the explainability. We are willing to lose on forecasting ability just so that we have something that's a little more explainable. That would be my lesson.
So we can collect some more of these as we go, but I want to get a couple of questions from the audience anyway. One is, curious what you guys have to say, but if decision makers are untrustworthy of analytics, how can we increase the number of analytic-minded people in high-level positions?
Promote everyone on the stage.
5 promotions right there.
Well, isn't it happening already just by the changing landscape of ownerships throughout organizations? I mean, I think that's
the other
that's
section.
been the natural evolution. So it is happening, I think, as a matter of course, just as more and more ownership groups are used to running businesses that are driven by the information that leads to their decision-making processes. So I think that's already happening, would be my response.
I think promoting incessantly the message that if you think A and you think B, let's not award it to who's been here the longest, who we respect the most, but let's put it through a process, whether you want to call it the scientific method or whatever. Let's put it through a process where we're actually using data, which is just what's happened in real life, to determine whether A or B is the path. And that doesn't seem so extraordinary, and I think any reasonable person will realize the benefits of that method instead of, aha, I went to high school with you, I'm sticking with you, let's do it, But if you really have a process that develops the expertise, it has to, I don't know, an alternative to something other than the scientific method.
I think everyone does, recognize that everyone does their own form of analytics, right? I mean, coaches will do it on their own. They'll look and they might watch 50 plays and say of those 50 plays, 45 resulted this way. So really you just start saying, okay, we're doing the exact same thing. We're just looking at 50,000 plays, right? And so then everyone's kind of an analyst in your organization. Because I think almost everyone, even the people who go by gut, they're relying on things they've seen or heard in the past. So that's how we try to frame it.
To me, org structure speaks volumes. And so I'm part of the people operations organization within Google, which is what we call human resources. And typically, you don't become the head of HR in any organization because of your love for data, right? And so because of that, all of these kinds of analytics departments and many other organizations, many other Fortune 500 companies get buried very deep within the organization. They don't have as much context, and therefore they're not addressing the problems that's most important for the business leaders and the head of HR. And so at Google, we were very clear that my role reported directly to the head of people operations, and that my team felt that they were always visible and knew what context, what problems they were trying to solve. So I think org structure speaks volumes, and all of you folks should have analytics folks reporting to you directly. That would be great.
So a little related to organizational structure, and we touched on it, but they ask it in a sharper way. Is it good to have diversity in approaches within an organization, or is it good to have a shared framework for decision making? Diversity in approaches, you guys are talking about process. Diversity in process or a shared process?
My thought is that the process should be very clear, it should be shared. There should be consistency and reliability and predictability about how you make decisions, right? That is very important. Otherwise, it just feels like you're just running helter-skelter. But that process should absolutely involve people coming in with diverse opinions, and there has to be something that teases that out, right? So that you don't have sort of groupthink going on. But the process itself should be the same.
I think much that fuels innovation is sort of the diversity of ideas, and many of the problems that we're grappling with, other industries have grappled with similar problems, often generations ago, and if it was just us and like-minded people and we weren't doing the Google 20% explore whatever you want or bringing in people with strange ideas, I think we would lose out on a lot of what's already been done or what could spark the innovation in our group.
I like diversity of data gathered, like
Oh, really?
gathering data in all different elements. We're all looking for unique inputs, right? The more the merrier, and the more testable the better. And so, if your expertise is knowing a player and knowing his personal dynamics with his teammates, like that's really useful, right? Gather it, we'll use it, we'll use it, right? If we don't have a lot of it, we might not weight it a ton, but we'll think about it and we'll use it.
So I'm going to stay with that for a second because there's another question here about how do you integrate subjectivity into your objective models. You've grown up in the business modeling things, and now you're saying you're going to integrate information that guys hear about players. How does that work? How do you bring that kind of subjective information into objective models?
I think you have to try to you have to try to be anchored around something, but you have to try to weigh everything as best you can, right? You get into a slippery slope pretty quickly, so you have to be careful. But it's the same argument in reverse we just made. Like, why would you throw out all this info? Why would you throw it away and say it's completely useless? Like, if you have some basis for which it could be useful, then you should be keeping it. So we have lots of some of the panels yesterday talked about psychology and the players and how they think and the way how they get along with each other and how coachable they are. All these things matter, right? And you might not have like standard data across that you could measure. If you could, then we wouldn't call it subjective anymore, right? But while it's but you still have to use it. You still have to use it.
I don't even just think the diversity of approach, but also, or the diversity of data, but also the diversity of approach individually in terms of how I'll look at players and whatnot, and realizing fully what you were saying in terms of context. Data really has a hard time with context. I can have as much information as I want, but if I've explained this to you, a term we use a lot is smell the gym. Just get in there and feel the game again and feel what the player is seeing and what his interactions are like with his teammates and his coaches. Those are data points. We just have to think about data in a different way and try to develop as much information around the core base of information that we use to evaluate a player. It might be on the periphery, it might be weighted heavily, it might be weighted lightly, but we definitely want to consider it and like Sam's saying, not throw it out because it can be very valuable.
So Alec, you're in a bit of a unique position because you're in on the ground floor with new ownership, new management at Cleveland. I know you think some about these issues. How are y'all thinking about process and the diversity of process and these issues?
I don't know. We're just starting with that. But I guess, I try to kind of rein us in a little bit, right? We don't have to get it all done in the first day. And so I think we'd like to set up processes around small decisions in the beginning and see how that plays out, right? Instead of just saying, okay, this is going to be our global vision and we're going to be this huge analytics organization, let's just concentrate on, how we assess players and free agents for now. Let's talk about kind of our boundaries and why we have these boundaries. I don't know if that answers the question, but I'd like to keep it limited in scope because you don't want to start off, especially when you're starting off from scratch with new people around you, you don't want to have a lot of failure and you want to have a lot of unknowns. You just say, okay, here's the path we want to go down. Does this sound right? And then if we stray from this path, what's that mean?
So gentlemen, we're down to, I think, last words, basically a couple of minutes. What kind of final words do you have for our audience today? Any last lessons or ideas?
I think the idea of like really realizing and being sensitive to the change that's going on with these persons and that these are experts and they have a tremendous amount of our advances have come from hypotheses that different scouts have had that don't show up in the scouting report, but show up when you probe at them and you spend time with them and you go on long drives with them and you learn from them. And I didn't know that or imagine that coming in. All I'd known of a scout was the portrayal at Moneyball where they all looked like Mr. Magoo's, So that, I think, was important and has been a big help.
Be curious. We talk a lot about that. Be curious, not critical.
Curious, not critical.
Google is hiring.
And stay open.
Stay open.
Stay open and relationships matter. They really do.
Alec, want to close us?
Sure. I mean, because I'm the only one on this panel who doesn't really understand math. I think it's even simpler for me, right? I mean, I'm just a lawyer, and we're trying to figure out the best way to get things done. That's the ultimate goal. You should never lose sight of that, right? I mean, if you can have an impact in your organization, that matters a lot more than being right all the time. And so when Cade approached me about this panel, I basically said, that's my job. That's really my job. I don't understand what 90% of the people in this room do, but to the extent it can make us better, maybe I can help get it to the people who make the decisions on the field or off the field.
Gentlemen, thank you. Appreciate it.